Hello, fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today we are talking about the king of weird himself, H.P. Lovecraft. And we're going to be talking about a story that is very rarely talked about. It's an outlier in his bibliography. It does not connect to the Cthulhu mythos. It is, in my opinion, the story most connected to the science fiction genre that he ever wrote. And it is one of the scariest of his that I have ever read. I read this back in the early 90s. I was a young teenager, and this scared me. It is an incredibly well-written story with a very strange central image, and I'm very excited to talk about it today. And the name of the story is In the Walls of Eryx. This is actually a collaboration between H.P. Lovecraft and a man named Kenneth Sterling. Kenneth Sterling went on to be a famous doctor and wrote quite a few scientific articles, but this is the only time I can find that he dabbled in fiction writing. And because this is a collaboration, we don't see the old ones or any of the usual tropes that H.P. Lovecraft is known for. This is really a unique story in his bibliography. It's not a type that we see very often. So before we get into the story, I'd like to give a quick history of its publication. In 1935, Kenneth Sterling wrote to H.P. Lovecraft. Kenneth Sterling was a high school student at the time, and he and Lovecraft started a correspondence that would last for about a year. And Lovecraft died soon after, about 2 years after this correspondence. And through this correspondence, Kenneth Sterling sent Lovecraft a story, a science fiction story with a very unique concept. And I'm not going to get into the concept yet because we'll talk about it when we talk about the story itself. Lovecraft absolutely loved the idea of this story, and they talked back and forth about it, and Lovecraft eventually decided to rewrite the story, keeping Kenneth Sterling's idea, which Kenneth was just fine with. So Lovecraft rewrote it, and scholars do believe that most of the prose itself is Lovecraft's, while we know that the idea of the story is Kenneth Sterling's. He wrote this story in January of 1936. Soon after, he started having health problems, and he was not a fan of doctors, so he didn't go see a doctor until about a month before his death in 1937, and it turned out that he had cancer of the small intestine. While he was alive, he tried to have this story published in the Walls of Eryx, and he tried Weird Tales, Astounding Stories, Blue Book, Argosy, Wonder Stories, and possibly, we don't know for sure, Amazing Stories, and all of these turned him down. It wasn't published until after his death when it was resubmitted. We don't know if it was by Kenneth Sterling or who, but it was resubmitted to Weird Tales, and at that time it was published in October 1939's issue. I read it in this book, which is a book called The Transition of H.P. Lovecraft, and is most of what they call his juvenilia. So it's stuff that he wrote early in his life before he really focused on his writing career. And it's so interesting to me because the introduction is all about him growing up and being a youth and writing these early stories. They don't really even talk about the Walls of Eryx at all. And it's funny that this whole part of the book is stuff that he wrote just when he was starting to figure out what kind of writer he wanted to be, and then suddenly right at the end it jumps to this story that was the second to the last story he ever wrote in his life. People don't know where to put this, and it's because it's a collaboration, which is why I say this is the scariest Lovecraft story that you've never read, because it doesn't get a lot of attention, and it's because of the fact that it's a collaboration. But I feel that the collaboration really is what made this story so wonderful. Let's dive into it. Like most of Lovecraft's fiction, this story is in the first person. And it takes place, it's one of the only Lovecraft stories where we actually see man traveling in space. I know in a lot of his stories, people's souls are transported out into the cosmos, but in this case, we're looking at humanity in the future, and they have become spacefaring, and they've created a base on Venus. And the reason they're going to Venus is to mine and collect these spherical crystals that hold incredible amounts of power. An egg-shaped one, he says in the story, could power Chicago for a year. So man has gone to Venus to try and find as many of these crystals as they can to use to power the cities on Earth. Now, this is a Venus of the 1930s, and what I mean by that is astronomers hadn't really figured out what was going on Venus, and a lot of the science fiction writers at that time considered that Venus would be a jungle. And there's a lot of examples of this in science fiction. The one that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head is The World of Null A by A.E. Van Vogt. I believe, if I remember correctly, a large chunk of the end of that novel takes place on a Venus that is covered with jungle. And we see the same thing happening here in this book. The narrator of this story is Kenton J. Starfield. And a lot of scholars, of course, believe that that is a nod to Kenneth J. Sterling, the collaborator with H.P. Lovecraft on this work. And he leaves base on a solo mission trying to find some of these crystals. And he has a machine that points him towards where the crystals are. He is equipped with a breathing apparatus that is fueled by oxygen cubes. So he has this mask that he wears that is fueled by oxygen cubes. And he also has a leather protective suit. So in Lovecraft's mind, humans could survive on Venus without a completely hermetically sealed spacesuit. He also has a flame pistol, and this allows him protection if he has to fight the lizard men. Lizard men are the indigenous life on Venus. They are not actually genetically based on lizards. They just look like lizards to the Earthlings, so the Earthlings call them lizard men. And the lizard men, the natives of Venus, worship these crystals in a religion that isn't really understand, but they worship these crystals, and they do everything in their power to stop or stymie the work that man is doing trying to collect these crystals. And it's gotten to the point that they destroy tech, or they will sometimes attack humans. And Kenton has a very backward and downright racist view of these Venus natives. He thinks they're no better than animals and doesn't even really believe that they have a language. He can't in his brain think of them as anything more than just kind of a stupid animalistic species that they have to deal with. Now, these Venetians have built buildings and actually have cities that the Earth people are just kind of ignoring. So his views are obviously not giving the Venetians any credit. And this starts this kind of colonial concept that runs throughout the story that we'll talk about a lot more later. So the first part of this book is his journey, and it's only a few pages. This story in this copy of the book is 25 pages long, and this is about the first maybe 5 to 7 pages. He has to walk through the jungle and follow his machine that's pointing him to crystals, and we get just a description of the jungle. And it is very lush, very overgrown. The mud on the jungle floor won't even leave footprints because it's so wet and slimy that no imprint will stay. And he passes a lot of different species of plants, and he actually names a lot of them. And there's some very funny inside jokes that I didn't realize within this text that are the names of plants and insects that point to people that H.P. Lovecraft wasn't really a fan of in his life. There's a weed called wriggling acmens that many scholars believe are aimed at Forrest J. Ackerman, a correspondent who Lovecraft had a fight with over one of Clark Ashton Smith's stories. There's also Farnath flies, which people believe are poking fun at the Weird Tales editor Farnsworth Wright, and Oograts, which is derived from Hugo the Rat, which was Lovecraft's nickname for Hugo Gernsback, who was the editor for Wonder Stories. So he was using this text to poke fun at quite a few people that he had problems with in his life. At one point, he comes in contact with a plant that lets off a gas from its buds that make him hallucinate. And it takes him about 20 minutes to figure out how to get out of this plant's range so he's no longer hallucinating. And in his mind, he says eons had passed, but it was only 20 minutes on the surface. I really liked that little quick detail of that plant that gave him all these visions before we get to the main part of the plot of this story. And finally, he's going up this hill. He's really going around this plant that made him hallucinate. And he comes up over this hill onto a plain where there's just kind of this dirt plain, a clearing with not a lot of plants or anything like that. And just as he's coming out of the forest line, he runs into something and it knocks him back. And he gets back up and fills forward, and he comes into contact with an invisible wall. So the plane is blocked by this invisible wall. And he starts assuming that it's an invisible building, and he starts filling around it. And it seems to be circular in nature. And he's blown away by the technology that is allowing this wall to be completely invisible. And this is where the story really picks up. So from here on out, there will be spoiler warnings. I am going to talk about the entirety of this story and do a deep reading on it. If you haven't read it yet, please go read it really quick. It's a pretty quick read, and watch the rest of this video. This is a lot of fun if you don't know what's happening. It makes it really scarier that way. But if you've already read it or just want to keep on watching, stick with me, and I'm going to go into the deep read. So he's circling this wall, trying to find a way into it. And this plane is where his crystal reader had led him. So he sees in the middle of this plane, and it looks like it's just on a lump of dirt, is a sphere crystal like this big, which is absolutely huge, the biggest he's ever seen and the biggest that Earth has ever seen, because he knows all of the stones that have gone to Earth. This is the biggest. It's incredible. And as he's circling around this invisible building, he realizes that what he thought was a lump of earth is actually a dead body. And it's a dead body of one of the people that left the base a long time ago to go on a long solitary journey to collect these crystals. So there's just this dead body holding the crystal. And the dead body is not decayed, which means he's been dead for less than 24 hours. So, of course, Kenton is really confused by the fact that he's just lying dead in this open field holding this incredible crystal. And he realizes, of course, there's this wall here, so maybe that's the reason. But he wants to get at this crystal, so he goes all the way around the wall, and when he gets almost to the body, he realizes that there's an opening in this wall. And he's like, oh, I've made it to the front of this building. And he steps in like 2 or 3 feet, and the body's right there with the crystal. And he grabs the crystal, and he puts it in his leather suit. And he's super excited, but he's like, man, before I go, I just got to check out the layout of this building a little bit. This is incredible, this invisible building. So he walks a little deeper into the building, and he's feeling along the walls, and I can't imagine what this would look like. As I read this, I wondered in my head what this would look like as a movie. right? Because you could hire a mime, I guess, to do it, because he would have to be walking around in the middle of a plain with nothing there, but acting like there was walls about. It's very interesting to consider what this looks like. But he's feeling the walls, and he goes through this kind of what he felt like was a spiral and ends up in this main room. And there's 6 other corridors off of this. And he's been using the body as a site when it's connected to other things he can see out in front of him. So he's been trying to use that to keep his position. And he kind of feels around the building. He's shocked. He's amazed. And is like, okay, now I better go. And walks towards the body again the way that he came, and realizes, wait, I'm in a different corridor somehow. And he can't get back to the body. The rest of this story is the slow realization that he has that this is not a building. It is a maze. The walls of Eryx are a maze. An invisible maze. Which would make a maze so much harder if you couldn't even see the walls. You just have to feel your way through. And it's been set as a trap by the Venusians. In fact, as he gets close to realizing that he's going to run out of oxygen tablets or water tablets and die soon, the Venusians come out of the forest and they encircle the entire maze, and they stand there and they watch him, and they wriggle their tails in movement that he can only interpret as laughter. And it's very difficult to put into words how well written this really is. And this, for me, is Lovecraft's ultimate superpower. His prose are incredible. I know for some he can get wordy, but I like wordy. I'm okay with that. And he is writing at an absolutely astonishing level here. What I love in short stories and novellas, and you'll know this from watching my past deep reads, what I love is a strong central image. An image that guides the story, becomes a metaphor or an analogy for the statement that the story itself is trying to make. And this one does it, but the central image is so cool because it is invisible. And this poor person's journey of trying to traverse his way back through this maze is terrifying and claustrophobic and so scary. I know I just said terrifying and now I'm just saying scary, but it is. It's really crazy because the fact that it just looks like to him that he's standing on an open plain adds a level of psychological torture that is just insane. It is claustrophobic while being right out in the open. I can't stress how cool of an idea this is, and this is why you should read it. Even if you're watching this and you haven't read it, but you just wanted to listen to my deep read, I still recommend you go grab it. It's incredible just to experience how Lovecraft takes this character from a curiosity of an invisible building to the realization that, oh my God, I'm going to die in this trap. And I'm right out in the open. Incredible. Incredible. At the end, there is a moment that completes the arc of the initial narrative of colonialism. And I find this really interesting because everybody knows that Lovecraft was kind of a xenophobic racist. Kind of isn't even true. He was a xenophobic racist. And I know that there's going to be comments in this that people are going to freak out because I said that. And that's fine. Because even people of the time correspondence with Lovecraft felt that his xenophobia and racism was a little more extreme than the norm. This is just something that you have to accept about Lovecraft. It was more normal in his time to be a racist xenophobe, but he was even a little bit more than that. However, near the end of his life, he started moving towards from being such a staunch conservative to the concept of socialism, which he thought embodied a middle ground between liberalism and conservatism that he really thought was the best way to move forward as a government. And in this story, I love the fact that Lovecraft looks at colonialism and in the end, I think, went towards a different tactic than he usually did, in that he condemns colonialism. And that's one of the things that I love about this story, is that in this one, Lovecraft condemns colonialism. And what I'd like to do is read the last couple of paragraphs of this short story. So he's talking about the scroll that he's been writing in, which is where we get the story. If it does survive to be read, I hope it may do more than merely warn men of this trap. I hope it may teach our race to let those shining crystals stay where they are. They belong to Venus alone. Our planet does not truly need them, and I believe we have violated some obscure and mysterious law, some law buried deep in the arcana of the cosmos. In our attempts to take them, who can tell what dark, potent, and widespread forces spur on these reptilian things who guard their treasure so strangely? Dwight and I have paid. Dwight is the name of the corpse that was holding the crystal before he came into the maze. Dwight and I have paid, as others have paid and will pay. But it may be that these scattered deaths are only the prelude of greater horrors to come. Let us leave to Venus that which belongs to Venus. I am very near death now, and fear I may not be able to throw the scroll when dusk comes. If I cannot, I suppose the man-lizards will seize it, for they will probably realize what it is. They will not wish anyone to be warned of the labyrinth, and they will not know that my message holds a plea in their own behalf. As the end approaches, I feel more kindly towards the things. In the scale of cosmic entity, who can say which species stands higher, or more nearly approaches a space-wide organic norm, theirs or mine? I absolutely love those final two paragraphs of his scroll that he was writing while being trapped in the maze, because it forces him to look at his own bias towards these Venetians that he had the whole time. Lovecraft tacked on a very dark ending to this story, and I go back and forth on whether or not I feel like it would have been better if the story just ended there. I feel like it would be more symmetrical if the story ended there. Just this story of this one person's journey into a trap that represents, I think, the trappings of his own mind when trying to think about the natives of Venus that he was dealing with. And sometimes I really like Lovecraft's tacked on end. I can't figure out where I stand on it. The tacked on end tells the story of what happens right after Kenton dies. A rescue mission shows up, and unfortunately they're too late to save Kenton. But as they're landing, they hit the side of the maze, and they figure out that there's walls there, and they are just going to take the walls down. And they do figure out how to eventually dismantle the walls. But the interesting part is they decide that at the beginning of Kenton's narrative, when he was talking about how stupid and useless the Venetians were. In fact, he says, there's a line at the early part where he says, we should just bring as many soldiers from Earth as we can and wipe these guys out just to take care of this problem. And at the end, of course, he doesn't feel that way at all. He has a respect for the Venusians. They decide that his final message of leave to Venus what is Venus's is when he was insane, that he had been driven insane because of the maze. And they decide, of course, that they're going to look at what he said earlier when he was more sane, and they are going to bring soldiers to Venus to wipe out the Venetians. Very dark ending. But a true ending. And that's why I have such a hard time deciding if I liked the tacked on ending or not, because it is an ending that is true to humanity. It is what man does, right? And it is hopefully something that can change within us, but at the point that H.P. Lovecraft was writing this, it really was the awful colonial norm of the day. And I like that in the end, Lovecraft made this statement, and it's a statement that is kind of ignored because this story isn't read as often. It's thrown in with his juvenilia, which it's not. It's literally the second to the last piece of fiction that he wrote. So I think it should be considered maybe in a different light when you really get down to it. I love it. I think it's a great story. I hope that you read it, and I hope that you love it too. If you haven't, go check it out. It is 100% worth it. Thank you very much for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please click like, and if you like this kind of content, please subscribe. We're going to be making a lot more of it in the future. Thank you so much for watching.